Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary. I'm Carolyn Music, Chair of Christian Thought. Before we get started, I would just like to deal with some basic housekeeping. And first of all, this talk is being recorded and that the talk will last about 45 minutes. And there will be time for questions. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. We're probably aiming more for a 4:30 end, but that gives us a lot of time to finish and to have questions. There'll be two ways that we will be taking questions at the end of the talk. Either you can use the reaction button on the bottom and raise your hand, or you can raise it manually as well, but we can see you more clearly if you do it electronically. Or if you prefer, you can type your questions into the chat box, and Monique will read those questions out when we get to them at a particular time. And while I'm thinking of Monique and Courtney, who is the Zoom host, I would like to thank them for all their help and support. It really makes the talk so much more smooth and enjoyable. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to officially start with the proceedings by asking Monique to begin with the land acknowledgement before I introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Carolyn. We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Thank you so much, Monique. Okay, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Warren Kinghorn. Dr. Kinghorn is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Duke University Medical Center. He's also the Esther Cauliflower Associate Professor of the Practice of Pastoral and Moral Theology at Duke Divinity School. He's co-director. You're going to get tired just by listening to all the things that Dr. Kinghorn does. He's co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Cultural Initiative at Duke Divinity School, where he is also a staff psychiatrist at the Durham Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Durham, North Carolina. Now, his current teaching and scholarship centers on the way that Christian faith communities engage questions of mental health and mental illness. He has also written on the moral dimensions of combat trauma, on the philosophy of psychiatric diagnosis, and on the role of the Therapeutic Alliance in psychiatric medication prescribing. He is also co-author of the recently published Prescribing Together, a relational guide to psychopharmacology, which is published with the American Psychiatric Association. And what I'd like to say too is that the initiative that Dr. Kinghorn is involved with, the Theology, Medicine, and Cultural Initiative, I've been looking at the lectures, some of the lectures that have been prepared on that on the web page at Duke Divinity School, and they're wonderful lectures. They're free and they're superb. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Kinghorn, and so many other things that you're doing. And today you'll be speaking on what do emotions mean, Aquinas, Descartes, and modern mental health care. Welcome, Dr. Kinghorn.
Thank you, Professor Music, and thank you for all of you for making time on a Friday afternoon to be here today. I'm pretty amazed at the attendance and the registration, so thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here with you today for the departmental seminar. It's an honor also to give the public lecture tomorrow afternoon. That'll be on a kind of a lower key than this one. And I am just incredibly grateful to you for being here. This is a distinguished group. I know some of you by reputation, and I am just really honored to be here. I'm also more than a bit intimidated. This is, as I told Dr. Music, this topic is very much a work in progress for me. It's something that I have been eager to learn more about, to begin to think through, and I still feel like I'm in the process of thinking through these questions and topics. And so I hope that I can bring something of value to you today, and I'm sure that in the Q&A and in your reflections and comments, you'll bring value to me also. I am a clinician, I'm a psychiatrist, and I practice at the Durham VA hospital in the US Veterans Affairs healthcare system. And I also have the privilege of teaching and working as a theological ethicist at Duke Divinity School, where I do co-direct the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative and do a lot of mentoring and teaching of students who are interested in the applications of Christian theology and practice to the practices of healthcare, and especially of mental health care. And so the topic I'm in today is really fundamentally practical in nature, as I hope will be clear. So let me start. It's 2 p.m. on a Monday as I invite a 62-year-old man, and I've changed details and identifying information here, but let's call him Mr. Carter, into my psychiatric office at the Durham Veterans Affairs Medical Center. I'm one of the psychiatrists here in the mental health clinic, I say, and your primary care doctor referred you to see me. How can I help you? Doc, he says, I just haven't been feeling good. I feel anxious all the time and depressed. And my wife tells me that it's getting worse. And last week I yelled at her because she wasn't paying attention to what our cat was doing. And my wife doesn't deserve that. I'm in pain all the time from my back and from my knees. And COVID has been hard and I haven't been able to see people recently. I don't really know what's wrong with me. A lot of my patients come to me for many different reasons. Some are struggling with problematic behaviors such as compulsive shopping or substance use. Some are experiencing profound challenges in close interpersonal relationships. Some are increasingly struggling with memory and concentration and lots of other things. But nearly all are experiencing some form of unwanted emotional experience. And people describe this experience to me in different ways, but most often, not all the time, but most often it's somehow related to the language of depression and anxiety. That's a lot of what I see as an outpatient psychiatrist working in this federal system in the US. Depression functions as a vague term that means different things to different people, but my patients generally use it to describe either a kind of deep sadness or a kind of emotional flatness and joylessness, or some combination of the two. And anxiety also functions as a term that can mean different things to different people, but it often connotes a kind of visceral unease that patients may not be quite able to identify, but that I associate, and often they associate with fear or shame or some combination of the two. Indeed, these experiences are very common. The National Institute on Mental Health in the US estimated that before the pandemic, that 1 in 5 US adults, that's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men, experienced an anxiety disorder, such as generalized anxiety disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder or social anxiety in any year, with nearly 1 in 3 experiencing an anxiety disorder over the course of their lives. And I apologize, I don't have Canadian data for this, but I'm assuming that there's at least some substantial overlap between the US and Canada in these statistics, although I could be wrong about that. Among adolescents, the numbers are even higher. 32% of adolescents, that's 38% of girls and 26% of boys, experience an anxiety disorder in any given year. And in 2019, so this is before the pandemic, 72% of college women in the United States and 51% of college men said in a national biannual survey that they had felt overwhelming anxiety in the past 12 months, and that these numbers have been trending upward for a decade, as has almost every other measure of adverse mental health outcome in college and university students. And I think colleges in the US are feeling this very acutely. And the same is true for depression. So around, in any given year, about 1 in 12 people in the US and perhaps Canada also will meet criteria for a major depressive episode. And around 1 in 5 Americans will be depressed over the course of our lives. And these numbers are, I think, fairly stable throughout the world. And I think it's important to note that I'll be talking mainly about theories of the emotions in this talk, but that these realities that I've just named are not like out there somewhere among someone else. They're present in every community, in every city, in every university, in every department, in every Zoom call. And I'll be speaking more theoretically today, but just want to acknowledge that all the experiences that I'll be mentioning today are present right here on this call and in those whom we love and in our communities. And I would just encourage you, if this is you, don't keep it on an academic level and get help. Find the help that you need. And especially if you have any concern at all for your safety or any thoughts of suicide, then that would be really an urgent need to get help immediately. And I always want to name that whenever I talk about mental illness with any audience at all. But this is not just an abstract topic. This is something that we ourselves are experiencing on this call today and those whom we love. When it comes to treating unwanted emotions, perhaps a bit schematically, I would like to suggest that there's kind of two responses. How do I respond as a psychiatrist to unwanted emotional experience, and especially when patients come to me complaining of depression or anxiety, which often run together? In psychiatry, and at least in the tradition of American psychiatry in which I've been trained to practice, there are two principal responses that correspond to two different approaches to finding meaning in emotion. And this is pretty schematic here, but I want to suggest that there's two broad ways in which psychiatrists especially have been trained to think. These aren't incompatible with each other, but sometimes one or the other is primary. And the first of these is the primary thing that I want to try to interrogate and to ask questions about today, the symptom reduction model. The first model is actually not to find intrinsic meaning in emotional experience as such, but simply to narrate problematic or unwanted emotions as symptoms to be reduced by whatever means is available and effective. We might call this the symptom reduction model of unwanted emotional experience. And this has been more or less, I would argue, the default stance of American psychiatry, which has influenced Canadian and world psychiatry since the publication of the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980. I have an old copy of the DSM-3 here, which was a really important volume. And to make a long story short, this is not about the history of modern psychiatry, but in the 1970s, American psychiatry was experiencing a crisis of internal and public confidence. Psychoanalysis, which was still dominant in academic departments of psychiatry, was internally divided among rival movements with rival models of formulation and diagnosis that sometimes publicly disagreed with each other. There were very public debates about psychiatric diagnosis in the 1970s, and especially over the diagnosis of homosexuality, which appeared in the first two editions of the DSM in 1952 and 1968, and was still present in the DSM in the early 1970s when what we would now call the gay rights movement became much more public and visible after Stonewall. And this brought a lot of unwanted attention and public scrutiny to psychiatry, and a lot of charges that psychiatry was either didn't know what it was doing in terms of its diagnoses or was intrinsically political in its practice. And then this was related to what's loosely been called the Anti-Psychiatry Movement, exemplified by writers as various as Thomas Aquinas and R.D. Laing, and on a more theoretical level, Michel Foucault. This was in full swing and was undermining trust in psychiatry, as well more powerfully as movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And so as a result, the American Psychiatric Association, which both publishes the DSM and also defends the professional interests of American psychiatrists, which has always been a key, conflict of interest, commissioned Robert Spitzer of Columbia University to revise the DSM to place diagnosis on a more scientific, and by that I meant less political footing. And the DSM-3, which was published in 1980, was designed to be, the document said, atheoretical with respect to etiology. It was characterized not by a theory of mental illness or of human psychological functioning, but rather as a collection of diagnoses that were defined by particular sets of diagnostic criteria. The DSM-3 introduced to our language now very familiar terms like major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, all of which came about in 1980. And it defined each disorder as a set of experiences and behaviors that could, in theory at least, be reliably recognized and recorded by an interviewer with minimal theoretical training. So to have major depressive disorder in DSM-3 just is to have 5 out of 9 symptoms, including low mood and loss of pleasure and increased or decreased appetite or increased need for sleep, thoughts of suicide, and so on. This new nomenclature was intended to pave the way for a biological revolution in psychiatry, and I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, where clear, reliable diagnoses could give rise to research that would identify causal biological pathways for various forms of mental illness. But for various reasons, this really hasn't happened. We have a lot of information, but we don't have the kind of clear pathways that was envisioned at that time, 40, 50 years ago. There was, though, a revolution, and it was that it was this idea that mental health treatment meant to have this identification of unwanted experience and behavior as symptoms, and doing this in a way that had broad appeal and kind of standardized the way that diagnosis functioned, made it possible to develop more and more systematic measurement scales for these symptoms, including some that were based directly on the DSM criteria. And then once you have measurement scales, people could conduct epidemiological studies to measure the prevalence of diagnoses in populations. So the statistics I just quoted are drawn from that movement, and to conduct treatment studies where the endpoint of a successful treatment, or what we would not say an evidence-based treatment, is symptom reduction. So symptoms will be recorded on scales. If there's a statistical difference in a treatment group versus a control group by the end of a study, that's usually measured in terms of symptom reduction, then that's what then gets instantiated in evidence-based paradigms as effective treatments. And so to be evidence-based in psychiatry is to be able to show statistically that one's intervention, whether that's a medication intervention or whether that's an intervention of psychotherapy, is able to reduce symptoms. So a lot of American psychiatry and a lot of world psychiatry for the last 40, 50 years has been dominated by this model of symptom reduction as the goal of good psychiatric care. This larger framework of the symptom reduction model, though, has always been in balance sometimes with a different understanding of the meaning of emotion, which we might call broadly a personal integration model. And this is largely found in individual schools of psychotherapy. So those of us who've been through or who've led particular forms of psychotherapy and trained in specific approaches, the different approaches have different theories of what the emotions are. They're not all the same. But the psychotherapies do often have assigned specific meaning or salience to emotion. Emotions may or may not be cognitive in nature, but they can signify, they often signify something of salience for the individual. And attending to the salience can be a context for meaningful change. So in one prominent example of this, Leslie Greenberg, prominent emotion-focused therapy founder, along with Susan Johnson, has said that emotions, he says, involve a primary meaning system that informs people of the significance of events for their well-being. Emotions also organize people for rapid adaptive action and provide the context for both behavioral and cognitive change. So what does any of this have to do with philosophy or religion? While I want to avoid making direct historical causal claims about the influence of either on the development of modern psychology and psychiatry, because I think that's not so clear, I do want to suggest that examining how the emotions, or as each of them would have said, the passions, are treated by two important Christian thinkers, Thomas Aquinas and René Descartes, can help to illumine both our current practices of mental health care and also ways that philosophy and theology and history might offer helpful pathways forward. And so as a non-medievalist, speaking to a group of folks with historical expertise greater than I, I'm going to jump into first a discussion of Aquinas and then of Descartes. But if I might summarize what I want to say, that Aquinas drawing on and expanding medieval theories of the passions frames the passions as movements of the embodied soul, and in which the passions serve as signs of love. And that when rightly ordered, the passions direct the wayfarer toward what is good and ultimately to God. Descartes frames the passions as actions of the body that affect the soul and therefore are passions of the soul. And in doing this, he mechanizes the body and offers a presciently modern account of emotion that sets the stage for the symptom reduction model. I want to have one handout today that I want to put in a Google Doc that you're welcome to access at any point, that is a framework of Aquinas on the passions.
Excuse me, Warren, could I just point out to the audience that you've kindly put that into the chat box?
Yes.
So if anybody wants to click on the handout, it just open up your chat box and you will see the link that Dr. Kinghorn has put up for us. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much, Caroline. Thank you. Writing the Summa theologiae in the mid-13th century, Aquinas did not invent a theory of the passions from scratch. He drew from Plato and especially Aristotle, from the Stoics, from the medical theories of Galen, as mediated especially by Ibn Sina or Avicenna, and from Christian writers like Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius and Isaac of Stella and Hugh of St. Victor. But his treatment of the passions was at its time the most complex and thorough engagement of what we would now call emotion in the Latin world. Understanding Aquinas on the passions requires a brief tracing of his overall conception of the human person. First, following Aristotle, Aquinas held a hylomorphic view of the human as a unity of body and soul, in which the soul is the form or principle of life of the living body. The soul itself as the form of the living body could be understood in three dimensions. There's the vegetative soul that's common to all living things, which enables nutrition and growth and reproduction. There's the sensitive soul, which is common to all animals, including humans, which enables what we would now call sensation, perception, perceptual integration, working memory, and basic appraisals of salience, such as basic fear responses. And then for Aquinas, there's the rational soul, which enables humans to apprehend universals and the truths of reason, and ultimately to know God and the rational principles with which God has ordered the creation. Aquinas, these are three movements of the soul, but Aquinas held that these were not three different souls or three different substantial forms. The human is informed by one soul, the rational soul, of which the operation entails all of these faculties. Within this hylomorphic union, the subject of experience and behavior is not the soul alone, nor the body alone, but rather the person who is comprised of this body-soul union. Actions of the parts are attributable to the whole. So in Aquinas' vision, my eye does not see, I see with my eye. My brain does not process information, I process information with my brain. My soul does not think, I think by means of my soul and body. So the soul and body always are never split apart, but always refer to the integrated action of the whole. It's important to note that while Aquinas did hold that the rational faculty of the soul was not dependent on the body for its function, and he did this apart for confessional reasons as a Christian, and that the soul could retain existence and limited cognitive capacity in a separated state after the death of the body, thinking, as we're all doing right now, as I'm doing speaking and as you all are doing and listening, is for Aquinas still largely embodied. So right now, as I am speaking, I'm reading some words on a page and looking at your faces on a screen and wondering what your expressions mean for what I'm saying. I'm remembering what I've just said, and I'm modifying my tone, and I'm imagining your responses to my responses. And all of these for Aquinas depend on the operation of the sensitive soul, or we might say the sensitive faculty of the soul, and therefore the mediation of the body. So for Aquinas, although there is a rational function which is not entirely dependent on the body for its function, our basic psychological processes, as we're all doing right now, is bodily dependent. So second, the human who is this embodied soul has a direction. Humans just are, by our created nature, the kinds of beings who naturally desire our flourishing or happiness, or what Aquinas would call beatitude, or beatitudo. We just are the kind of beings who desire beatitude, who apprehend goods that we believe will lead to beatitude or happiness or flourishing, and who act to achieve these goods. So for Aquinas, as for Aristotle, it wasn't a kind of a question whether humans will act for what we perceive to be good. So when as a psychiatrist, I tell my clinical supervisees that people will do their best with what we've learned to get what we think we need in any given situation. That's, I think, a pretty good, helpful principle for mental health care, but it's all, and for life, but it's also something that would be fundamentally consistent with Aquinas's vision of the human directedness toward what we perceive to be good. For Aquinas, the Christian, though, this directedness was not just to any good, but rather to the highest good, the good that when attained will bring all desire to rest, and that is God. Humans are God's good creatures, being drawn to God on a journey to God. Humans are viators, or wayfarers. Humans are on the way to God, and he has a section in the Summa where he says that if the secunda part of the Summa is about humans on the way, the third part is about Christ as the way, with all of life narrated as a journey from God to God. So for Aquinas, the principal metaphor or image of the human was that of a wayfarer. And the journey of the human to the good and ultimately to God is enabled by embodied dispositions to act for the good, that is, by the virtues. And these are the intellectual virtues, the capacity to apprehend or the disposition to apprehend what's true, the moral virtues, the disposition to act for what's good, the theological virtues, which are infused by God to enable the human to attain God and the things of God. And correlatively, the journey can be derailed by embodied dispositions to pursue apparent goods that turn out to be harmful, and that would be vices. So what then is the role of the passions or emotions in the journey of the wayfarer to God for Aquinas? Aquinas describes the passions as acts which are common to humans and to other animals, but more properly, the passions are not properly acts, they're rather effects of the body-soul composite on being moved by an external agent. To be passive is to be moved by another, or more properly, the passions are effects on both soul and body by the movement of the appetite toward a perceived good. And whereas Aquinas affirms that it's appropriate to speak of the passions of the soul, the passions are properties of the soul-body composite. Every passion involves some form of bodily transmutation in response to an other. So the passions occur when the soul-body composite is moved by another. But how does this movement occur? The key for Aquinas is love, or amor. Aquinas describes love as complacentia boni, complacency in good, taking one's place with what one perceives to be good. When we apprehend someone or something whom we perceive to be good, and to lead to our happiness or our beatitude, then we unite that thing or person to ourselves in what Aquinas describes as an affective union. Aquinas believes not only that love provides orientation to all of the passions, but that love motivates everything that as humans we do. He remarks that every agent, whatever it be, does every action from love of some kind. And so, as you can see from the handout that is on the Google Doc, Aquinas divides the passions, and he's following tradition in much of what he does here, between the concupiscible passions, which I would kind of colloquially term the passions of immediacy, in which the object is apprehended immediately, and the irascible passions, or what I would colloquially refer to as passions of difficulty. And these are objects that are apprehended as arduous or difficult to attain or to avoid. And so within this framework, he then has a kind of classification of the different passions according to the movements of love. And he separates the passions into those that have mostly to do with the pursuit of a good on one hand, and those that have to do with the avoidance of evil on the other. So on one hand, we find what I would name the triad of approach. And I think of this as like two triads, one that has to do with approaching the good and another triad that has to do with avoiding what's harmful or evil. In the triad of approach, we find first is love, which is starts with the movement of the object apprehended in intention. Love then generates desire, which is that we then desire, we're drawn toward the object of our love. And this could be a person, it could be a good food, it could be whatever it is that we feel is going to in some way lead to our happiness or flourishing. And then when the desired object is attained, we feel delight, especially if that's a more sensual kind of attainment, or joy if it's a more intellectual kind of attainment. But delight and joy occur when the beloved object is attained, and we can rest in the presence of him or her or it. It's fundamentally rest in the presence of the beloved. On the other hand, we find an inverse triad of avoidance. And this begins what's usually translated hatred, but I would like to use the word repulsion instead, odium, which is the opposite of love. It's in intention, we seek to immediately identify something as not good for us and seek to distance ourselves from it. That leads to what I call the behavioral tendency of aversion, to actually to find distance from the thing that we perceive to be bad for us. This could, again, be a person or a situation or a thing. And if then that avoided evil arrives and is with us, then we feel pain, especially if it's in a bodily sense, or sadness, tristatia, if that is in a more of a non-bodily sense. But sorrow and pain are very much related for Aquinas. And then he has the irascible passions, which correlate to different states of that when the good or the evil is perceived to be either difficult to attain or difficult to avoid. Aquinas was not a clinician, but this way of framing the passions provides a way to make sense of emotional experience and even suggests some ways about how to act in light of them. This is best illustrated by Aquinas' treatment of the related passions of pain and sorrow, dolor and tristitia. We can think about how our modern concept of depression might in some way relate to Aquinas' passion of tristitia. Like all the passions, pain and sorrow are products of love, or fundamentally driven by love, products of an evil that's desired, but the movement is driven by love. Though in some ways they fall at the opposite end of the spectrum, at the terminus of the triad of avoidance. Pain and sorrow are the end result when something that we perceive to be evil has not been able to be avoided and is present with us, maybe even suffocating us. Pain has to do more with the experience of the body in the present. Sorrow is less directly connected to bodily feeling and may relate to the past and the future as well as the present. And Aquinas keenly observes that of the two, sorrow is more to be avoided. People will often endure physical pain to avoid interior sorrow, but rarely the reverse. Sorrow, Aquinas says, is caused by the presence of an evil or the loss of a desired good. And in some cases, can be so extreme that Aquinas says, even the interior movement of the afflicted soul is absolutely hindered, so that it cannot turn aside either this way or that. Sometimes even the external movement of the body is paralyzed so that a person becomes completely stupefied. I think it's hard to know what Aquinas is talking about. It's hard to make 800-year gaps in diagnosis, but it certainly seems like he's describing here what we would now consider either to be a severe form of melancholic depression or catatonia. Indeed, sorrow in its extreme form can harm the body by slowing the natural movement of the vital fluids. And Aquinas is throughout going to be using a basically Galenic humoral theory in the way that he thinks about bodily physiology. But this gives rise to a remarkably holistic and pragmatic set of possible remedies for sorrow. So in a question in the Summa on remedies for sorrow, he says, well, what helps alleviate sorrow? Well, seeking pleasure can help alleviate sorrow, especially finding some pleasure. Crying can help to alleviate sorrow because it's good to be able to express one's sorrow and sometimes to feel the comfort of others as a result. Seeking the company of sympathetic and loving friends can help to alleviate sorrow. The contemplation of truth can help to alleviate sorrow. And then he's got this lovely article on sleep and baths can alleviate sorrow, because anything that helps to quicken the body's movements can be a way in which the body can resume its patterns of health. So it's a pretty pragmatic treatment approach here. In summary, then for Aquinas, the passions are embodied signs of love. Properties of the body-soul composite that, when properly ordered, direct the human wayfarer on the path to beatitude. So how does this compare to Descartes? And how can Descartes help to illumine what's at stake in the way that the emotions are treated in modern mental health care? Despite his own self-narration of his singularity and uniqueness, Descartes is in many ways stands as a transitional figure between Aquinas' time and ours. He lived at approximately the chronological halfway point, with about 400 years separating him from Aquinas and from us, at least in terms of the writing we'll discuss today. But his work also, in some ways, carries on the medieval traditions of the passions, even as it also sharply breaks from them. In some ways, Descartes appears to us as a kind of medieval thinker, at least one who's thinking about medieval traditions. In other ways, a strikingly modern one. Before we consider Descartes' treatment of the passions, it would be helpful to set his life and thought in some context and to place his work on the passions in light of his broader views on the body. Descartes, being a generation younger than Francis Bacon, about 2 generations older than Isaac Newton, proximate contemporary Galileo, lived at a time of rapidly changing views about nature, the place of humans in relation to the cosmos, and method in the sciences. Descartes was educated in his formative years from about age 11 to 18 in the early 1600s at the University of La Flèche, a Jesuit institution where he was educated by Jesuit scholars. He was a contemporary, although not quite the same age, of the mathematician and priest Marin Mersenne, whom he came to know better later in life. And he lived at a time when one of the key tasks of Christian philosophy, at least in the schools, was to preserve a proper role for the supernatural, that is God, against the twin threats of a thoroughgoing naturalism, often in Aristotelian form, and the practices of Renaissance magic and occultism, which rendered even mysterious forces imminent and possibly controllable. In Mersenne's solution, Mersenne was a mathematician, but also a priest, was actually to turn to mechanism, to deny intrinsic life or spiritual force to matter whatsoever. Matter was mechanism, completely inert. And this therefore would preserve a proper metaphysical place for the supernatural while insulating the supernatural from the creep of what became known as the natural sciences or natural philosophy. Descartes was influenced by Mersenne's mechanism, and when he came to publish the discourse on the method of rightly conducting the reason and seeking truth in the natural sciences, or we would say discourse on method, in 1637, as we'll see, one of his primary concerns was to depict the human body as a mechanism that was ripe for observation and manipulation as a machine. It's also worth noting that Descartes primarily understood himself as a scientific thinker. The discourse on method was intended as a preface to his three-volume work on optics, geometry, and meteors, or meteorology, and can be read in part as a manual for how to go about the work of scientific progress. And it's worth noting that Descartes was interested in medicine for much of his life. And I say this as a physician and thinking about how Descartes is in some ways kind of at the root of modern biomedicine. He dissected animals. So for all of his being labeled a rationalist, he actually spent a lot of time in sort of direct observation of the natural world. He read William Harvey's De Motu Cordis on the motion of the heart, which is a pioneering work that came along in the decades previously. He was offered a chair of medicine at the University of Bologna in 1633, which he declined, but it shows how he was regarded for his medical interests. And he told a patron in 1645 that the preservation of health has always been the principal end of my studies. He was also very solicitous for his own health, although unfortunately he died at a fairly young age, in his early 50s, after, I think, rising early, which was not his want, and contracting pneumonia and passing away. In some of the more familiar sections of the discourse, we see 3 Cartesian strategies at work that help us to understand what he's doing in his later account of the passions. First of all, we see Descartes committing himself to what I might call a clearing of story and tradition. He rejected, and this is going to be familiar to all of us in terms of Descartes' method, but I want to put a little bit of different light on it. He rejected received tradition as a basis of knowing. And he says in the Discourse on Method that he came to doubt whether the books he'd studied at La Flèche had taught him anything. He said, eventually, I entirely abandoned the study of letters, resolved no longer to seek any other science than the knowledge of myself or of the great book of the world, which I've encountered a lot of students now that say similar things. And he adopted his methodological approach. He says, I just wanted to sweep them wholly away. He he adopted a posture of universal doubt. And this is when we get, of course, that he couldn't doubt his own existence as a thinking thing, and so arrived at the certainty of his own existence. I think, therefore I am. And the momentous part of this, I think, is not so much Descartes' movement to universal doubt, but his decision to clear away all of this prior education and suppositions that in some ways he still claimed, but didn't claim any authority over him, as Aquinas would have. This led, though, directly to a dualism of body on one hand and mind or soul or consciousness on the other. He says, I thence concluded that I was a substance whose whole essence or nature consists only in thinking, in which that it may exist has no need of place or is dependent on any material thing, so that I, the mind by which I am what I am, is wholly distinct from the body and is even more easily known than the latter. And as such, although the latter were not, it would still continue to be all that it is. And Descartes did not believe that the mind inhabited the body like a captain inhabits a ship, but he did believe in a very close relationship between the mind and the body. And as we'll say later, he clarifies that he thinks that the point of intimate relationship is in the pineal gland. But I wanted to consider the moral legacy of Descartes' dualism, which is not, I would suggest, that he posited an immaterial mind or soul as the locus of our humanness and identity, because others were doing that, and that certainly had a lot of precedent in the Christian tradition, but rather that he posits the body as that which remains after the locus of our humanness has been extracted. The body, in other words, is not the locus of what it means to be human. The body, as unthinking extension, is specifically defined against what makes us fully human. So we're well on the way to consider the body as a kind of machine. And then Descartes goes there. After an excursus on God, Descartes then spends most of the rest of the discourse on method focused on the body. He has a long exposition of the working of the heart that reflects his reading of William Harvey. And he says that it's reasonable to see the body as a machine made by the hands of God, which is comparably better arranged and adequate to movements, more adequate than is any machine of human invention. And the human body then is a machine, and to be human is to be a thinking soul that inhabits a machine body. And then he turns to animals. Are animals also thinking souls that inhabit machine bodies? And he says, no, because animals don't act from reason. They lack souls and are entirely machines. So in this move, Descartes separates the human mind from the body and also the human mind from animals. The only non-mechanized thing in the universe, other than, of course, God, is the human mind. All else is senseless machine. And this is what allows him to understand the human soul as immortal. I would argue that Descartes is a prototype of social psychologist Nick Haslam's concept of mechanistic dehumanization, that when we begin to deny what's essentially human to other bodies, we begin to treat them as machines. We're well on the way then to a way of thinking, a way of acting that sees the body as something that's just fine to use and to manipulate. And now, having established that the body is not what makes us fully human, having made the body then safe for manipulation and experimentation and so on, clearing out, like reserving the soul with its theological significance from the body, Descartes then confesses his love for medicine. He says that having learned some things about physics, to keep them concealed would be to fail to do his part to promote the general good of mankind. And I want to read a fairly extended quote here that is familiar to many of us. He says, for by these principles of physics, I perceived it to be possible to arrive at knowledge highly useful in life. And in room of the speculative philosophy usually taught in the schools, to discover a practical philosophy by means of which, knowing the force and action of fire, water, and other bodies, we might also apply them in the same way to all the uses to which they're adapted, and thus render ourselves the lords and possessors of nature. And this is a result to be desired, not only in order to the invention of an infinity of arts, by which we might be enabled to enjoy without any trouble the fruits of the earth and all its comforts, but also and especially for the preservation of health, which is without doubt of all the blessings of this life, the first and fundamental one. For the mind is so intimately dependent on the condition and relation of the organs of the body, that if any means can ever be found to render men wiser and more ingenious than hitherto, I believe that it's in medicine that they must be sought for. And he says, it's true that the science of medicine as it now exists, this is in 1637, contains few things whose utility is very remarkable. But without any wish to depreciate it, I'm confident that there's no one, even among those whose profession it is, who does not admit that all at present known in it is almost nothing in comparison of what remains to be discovered, and that we could free ourselves from an infinity of maladies of body as well as of mind, and perhaps also even from the debility of age, if we had sufficiently ample knowledge of their causes and of all the remedies provided for us by nature. And Descartes actually concludes the discourse by saying that he's resolved to devote the rest of his life to, he says, endeavoring to acquire some knowledge of nature, which shall be of such a kind as to enable us therefrom to deduce rules in medicine of greater certainty than those at present in use. And if he did not do this, he would not consider his life to be successful. So I just want to note that if Descartes were to show up today and were to, be, invited to a non-specific university professorship at Duke or maybe at Calgary, and they would ask him, like, what department would you want to exist in? My guess is he would probably not want to exist in philosophy. He probably would want to be a medical research scientist. He'd want to see himself at the cutting edge of manipulation of the body so as to become lords and possessors of nature. So this brings us at last then to Descartes' treatment of the emotions, as most fully represented in his last published work before he died, The Passions of the Soul, which was written at the urging of his student and in many ways intellectual equal and interlocutor, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. In some ways, despite his avowed refusal to acknowledge past authorities, Descartes' treatment of the passions shows clear continuity with the medieval tradition of the passions that had gone before him. He preserves the traditional designation of the passions of the soul, including mostly the word passions, although I can't absolutely promise this, but Thomas Dixon in his history says that Descartes was actually the first to use the French term emotion and to introduce the word emotion into psychological discourse. He designates 6 passions as primary, preserving the traditional medieval passions of love, hate, reversion, desire, joy, and sadness, and adding a 6th fundamental passion of wonder or admiration. He agreed that the passions were important for a well-lived life and the possibility of training and habituating the passions. So he was not completely against the passions or saw the passions always as only an enemy. He defines love in a way that's on the surface very similar to Aquinas, as he says, an excitation of the soul which incites it to join itself in volition to the objects that appear to be suitable to it, which has a kind of, an overlap with definitions that had gone before. And though he does not use the distinction of the irascible and the concupiscible, he acknowledges that some passions, such as hope and despair, have to do with the likelihood that even with effort, we'll be able to attain the hoped for good or feared evil. So in some ways, Aquinas is clearly in continuity with the traditions that had gone before. Furthermore, like Aquinas, Descartes makes clear that the experiences that we have when we think of ourselves as thinking are not entirely a function of the soul, but of the body also. Sensation and most emotional experience, as we'll see, and especially visual memory, but also episodic memory, memories are stored in the body. The feeling of the body and so on are embodied realities for Descartes. So caricatures of Descartes is thinking that all of our cognitive experiences are wholly located in the soul and not in the body, or really don't do justice to the way in which he saw the mind and the body as intimately connected. But in more fundamental metaphysical ways, Descartes' treatment of the passions is radically different and new. First, for Aquinas, as we remember, the passions of the soul are actions of an agent on the body-soul composite. The embodied soul is moved by another. For Descartes, on the other hand, the passions of the soul are actions of the body. It's the body that acts on the soul to cause the soul's passions. Second, and related to this, for Descartes, soul and body are no longer related as a hylomorphic unity is formed to matter, but rather are material and immaterial substances intimately related to, but substantially different from one another, with communication somehow localized in the body and especially in the pineal gland in ways that, as we as we all know, Descartes never really figured out how exactly that could work. But that was again his hypothesis, that he hoped that further investigation would elucidate like how this could be possible. Descartes does preserve the view of a rational soul, though no longer as the form of the human body, but as a complete immaterial substance. But he rejects the Aristotelian and Thomistic doctrines of the vegetative and sensitive souls that serve as the body's principle of life, with regard to the body's organic functions. The body itself is no longer living by virtue of the soul. The body, rather, like non-human animal bodies, is a machine. The heart and brain and muscles and other organs of the body communicate with one another by means of physical animal spirits. So spirits here were physical, biological quanta, which are transmitted through the blood vessels and nerves. And some bodily activities and movements, like reflexes, occur simply through mechanical movements that have nothing to do with the soul. They might be recognized by the soul, but they're not mediated by the soul. The passions of the soul then are fundamentally mechanically produced. And this is clear in the case of sense perceptions or sensations referred specifically to an external object, such as when one feels burning pain from touching a hot object. But the passions are no less mechanical in the case of passions like love and sadness and wonder that can't be localized, but that are referred to the soul itself. Descartes' definitions of the passions of the soul are perceptions or sensations or excitations of the soul, which are referred to it in particular and which are caused, maintained, and strengthened by some movement of the physical animal spirits. The passions incite and dispose the soul to will certain actions or responses, so they get a response. But the passions are fundamentally, if they have an end, and some argues that the passions are still teleological for Descartes, the passions function in a way to preserve and protect the body, or the actions of the body function to preserve and protect the body that then become the passions of the soul. And the soul can inversely influence through the pineal gland to drive the animal spirits in a way that the body moves in accordance with the soul's will. So for the arm to move is the soul communicating with the brain to then send animal spirits to different parts of the muscle, which then helps to contract certain movements, and that's how the body moves. But this means that the body is no longer properly the locus of feeling. The feeling self is not an embodied soul existing in a world of other creatures being moved by them. But the feeling self is the soul in intimate communication with the material world that includes the body, that's entirely mediated through the body. The body becomes part of the material world, not part of the self or of the creature properly. It also means that the passions are conceived with more suspicion than is the case for Aquinas, as phenomena to be kept in check and to be restrained. Descartes held really a fundamentally neo-Stoic view of the passions, that they could be useful, but they needed to be trained through rational thought. He holds that we can train the passions so that they're useful for us, but the primary way to make good use of the passions is to gain control of them, to apply, he says, firm and decisive judgments concerning the knowledge of good and evil. And therefore we can bring the unruly passions under control. So what difference does Descartes' theory of the passions, instead of Aquinas' theory of the passions, make for the way that we understand and respond to overwhelming or unwanted emotional experience? We'll kind of begin to bring it back to modern mental health care. First of all, they're not completely different. Both accept that the passions can be habituated and ordered in a way that aids and facilitates the life and flourishing of the person. Both would accept and promote what we would now consider cognitive strategies for emotional regulation. Both have room for biological interventions, but neither says much about this. But there's several ways that Descartes and the broader theories of the body as a machine or mechanism that he championed makes a difference for the way that we refer to emotion. First, it becomes much more possible to attribute emotional experience to the body, which gives the body a priority of place when thinking about the emotions. In his History of the Emotions, Thomas Dixon argues that Descartes' conception of the passions of the soul contributed, he says, to the disappearance of the will as the locus of human agency, not in Descartes, but after Descartes, and its gradual replacement by the passions and affects, and later emotions themselves, and finally by the body. Second, he says, second for Descartes, the passions are not intrinsically meaningful, except as bodily responses that are programmed for the preservation of the body's health and well-being. Whereas for Aquinas, the passions are the body-soul union's signs of love. For Descartes, the passions are signs of the body, analogous perhaps to my stomach telling me that I'm hungry, to which my mind then has to make a judgment and to react. Third, in the case of unwanted emotion, it becomes natural to imagine a war or struggle between myself, my soul, and my body, treating the body as an enemy to be conquered rather than a constitutive part of myself. It also makes possible a dualism between myself and my body, a self-body dualism, so that I can say of any given emotion, it's not me, it's my body. And to see our experience is located somehow outside of ourselves. And fourth, because the body is a machine for Descartes, it becomes eminently imaginable, really likely, though Descartes did not describe this himself, that one would seek to control unruly passions, not just by neo-Stoic cognitive techniques, which Descartes would love CBT, I think, in our time, but by technologies that directly alter bodily states, such as medication and somatic technologies. These technologies are then able to be thought of not as interventions on the person, but as interventions on the body machine that serves as, in some way, a material substrate of the soul's experience. And all of these things, in my view, create a world in which unwanted emotions can be understood as meaningless problems to be eradicated in any way possible. And it gives rise to the symptom reduction model of clinical practice. This isn't intrinsically a bad thing to eliminate unwanted emotions, but it does then create a lot of power, gives a lot of power to whatever program or system or institution claims then authority over that process. In this case, it delivers a lot of power to biomedicine. So in closing, what would I hope for as an alternative to the symptom reduction model? Or more specifically, how might closer attention to Aquinas' account of the passions make a difference for practices of modern mental health care? I want to offer 4 principles that I'd love to just talk about and get your responses in the Q&A. The first would be directionality, that Thomas's account of the emotions as embodied signs of love presumes that emotions are intrinsically meaningful, though they need not always be so. It's always possible in Aquinas' theory of psychological function that there could be some dysfunction in the body in which the body is not permitting the appropriate operation of the sensitive faculty of the soul, which then affects the person's capacity for reason. But rather than treating emotion as primarily an eruption or action of the body that has meaning only insofar as the mind or soul attributes meaning to it, which is Descartes' view, emotion in Aquinas' perspective is engaged primarily as a sign of love, as a kind of sign whose function is to guide the viator, the wayfarer, toward beatitude. Emotions should first be engaged as embodied signs of love, and then only if they make no sense in that context should they be primarily understood as bodily dysfunctions to be corrected. So the primary question about the emotions for Aquinas is, in any given emotional experience, whether it's happiness or sadness or anything, is what are my emotions telling me about whom or what I love? Of course, that's never a simple question. It's not a question that admits of only one answer, but it sets us on a direction of wondering about the structure of our loves. The second principle would be a refusal of dualism. I realize that in some ways Aquinas can be understood as a hylomorphic dualist, but I want to refuse a kind of substance dualism in which the body is a machine and the soul is the seat of personhood and self-identity. And I think this invites what tomorrow I'll call a self-body dualism, you mentioned a minute ago, that can also easily become a self-symptom dualism. So self-body dualism would be the idea that the locus of my unwanted emotion is not me, but my body, and therefore my body needs to be modified as a machine. And self-symptom dualism would be the idea that my unwanted experience is somehow not me, but it's symptoms that somehow I have that are external to me. Now, as a clinician, I want to offer a huge caveat to my concern about that, which is that when we're under this immense blanket of depression or anxiety, when things are overwhelming, it can be incredibly helpful to envision and to see our experiences as in some way external to us, this process of externalization. Paradigmatically, children with OCD really are helped when they can begin to look at OCD as a kind of a common challenge or a common enemy to be confronted by the therapist and client working together. And that can be really helpful in motivating change. And so I think that there can be modes of this that can be very helpful. But if this dualism of self and symptoms or of self and body become permanent, then this delivers us to systems that promise to control our bodies and our experiences, ultimately, I think, eroding agency and heightening the power of biomedicine over our lives. Third would be, and this really deserves a conversation of its own, but a reframing of the meaning of rationality. Descartes, as best as I can tell, maintains a neo-Stoic account of rationality as it relates to the passions, that reason helps us to gain control over unruly passions so that the passions don't distract us on the way to virtue, where virtue is the capacity for rational action that isn't unduly hindered by unruly passions. And that the passions might even aid in some cases if they're appropriately trained. But for Aquinas to be rational, I would argue, is ultimately not just to be able to have discursive thoughts and to write treatises, but to participate in the ratio by which God has ordered the world. It's to conform to God and to the things of God. And in that sense, the passions can participate in rationality, can be rational in ways that it's not clear that they can be for Descartes. And fourth and finally, argue that it's good to move from control to connection and communion. For Descartes, the primary relationship for the passions is the relationship of body and soul, with the body acting on the soul experiencing the body's action as passion or emotion. But for Aquinas, as we may recall, the primary relationship is between the body-soul composite and those external things or ideas to which the appetite responds with love or aversion. The world of the passions for Aquinas is a relational world in a way that's not, or at least not as much, for Descartes. I work with a graduate student here at Duke, Matt Elmore, who recently commented that for Augustine, who Aquinas, of course, is always drawing from, the acting person is not a self-enclosed, self-sufficient will, but rather a lover-seeking communion. I think Aquinas has this basic vision of the human being. And what would it be like in modern mental health care if our first question about unwanted emotion were not, how can this be modified? Although that's, of course, an appropriate question because people are suffering. But rather, what kinds of connections are needed to transform desire into delight and joy? That, I think, would be a therapy consistent with Thomas' vision in the truest sense. So back to Mr. Carter, an unfinished story. I sat with him in the clinic that day. I validated his global experience of sadness and anxiety. I asked a lot more questions about his recent experience, but also some of his earlier life experiences that helped me to understand how his approach to his emotions over the course of his life had developed. I reflected with him that being in constant pain is hard and would be a trial for anyone. And we discussed ways to care for his body in a way that would minimize his pain and help him to cope with the pain that could not be eradicated. Then I asked him whom or what he loves. And he stopped and thought about that. And he responded that he loves his wife and his children and his grandchildren, and he's looking forward to spending Christmas with them. We discussed what he hopes and longs for, what he wants his life to be about. And I told him that I'd walk alongside him, that I would prescribe a medication for anxiety, not because it would fix things that are broken, but because it can help him to pursue the paths that bring joy to him. Mr. Carter is not a machine to be fixed, but a wayfarer to be attended. And it's my pleasure to walk alongside him. Thank you all very much for your presence today, and I'm really excited to learn from you in this conversation to follow.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kinghorn. That was a wonderful talk that covered such a wide range of analysis in regard to not only medicine, but theology, personal diagnosis and interaction with your patients. A very powerful conclusion, I think, to application of what you're talking about in the abstract. And I also like too that I think Thomas Aquinas looks like a very good role model to look towards in discussing things on mental illness and what he provides. So in comparison to Descartes, perhaps. But what I'd like to do now is open up the floor for questions, and to remind you that there are two ways you can ask a question. You can either use the option for raising your hand, or you can type into the chat. And I see we already have a question by Jim Hume. Jim, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. While you were speaking about Thomas, I couldn't help thinking of what we might have learned from the one Aristotelian commentary he didn't write, which is on the Poetics, where, you know, the discussion of pleasure and fear sort of cross over the lines that you've drawn in your chart there. And it's specifically from an observation of things that are fearful and pitiful that we can gain pleasure in I think an almost therapeutic context of art, you know, watching a tragedy in that case, whereby our emotions are, well, I would say externalized, to use your phrase a minute ago, and directed towards, you know, someone outside of ourselves for the purpose of cleansing those emotions, not eliminating them as such, but cleaning them up for a larger social purpose, right? For the good of the city that's there in the audience watching the drama unfold. So I wonder whether what either of our subjects today, Descartes or Aquinas, what room they would have made for art, and specifically, I suppose, this drama in terms of a kind of a therapy that would put emotions on a different perspective altogether.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I believe, and I would need to go back to this, but I believe that in this discussion of fear in the Treatise on the Passions and the Summa, that Aquinas does reference at least once the theater and the idea that there can be certain forms of fear that do bring pleasure, but when there's an understanding that they don't immediately threaten the integrity of the creature. And so I believe that he accounts for that. I might be wrong, and I would need to go back and check. I can't remember the exact reference, but you're right. I think that's an important it's an important reality of human life. In his discussion in Prima Secunda, question I think 38, where he discusses the tears as a mode of treatment for sorrow, he does speak about ways in which the experience of expressing one's emotion actually then leads to a kind of, I'm paraphrasing in modern talk, but a kind of a perception of integrity, where one sees oneself sad and feels a kind of peace and pleasure in being able to be honest and genuine with oneself. He wouldn't speak in those 20th century terms, but that's basically how he says. So I think there is a role for a more complex emotions where sadness and pleasure can coexist for sure. So it's not that we only feel one passion at one time. Of course, as a psychiatrist, I'm keenly aware that people can feel both fear and pleasure and sadness all at the same time, and so sometimes and other things. And so disentangling sometimes the different passions is highly complex.
Monique, would you like to read out the question in the chat box, please? Thanks.
I would be happy to. So the analysis you've presented doesn't touch on the interaction of the individual with fellow humans, animals, nature, and other systems of various sorts. Yet that seems like the locus of a lot of difficulties among those seeking psychiatric and psychological help. So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will talk more about the social tomorrow when I talk about the pitfalls of reductionism when it comes to mental illness. You're right that the talk that I just gave didn't focus on that, but I would argue that, and I don't think that either Aquinas or Descartes were ignored the social reality of what we now call psychological struggle. But for Aquinas, the passions are as I said, are deeply relational in the way in which to live the life of the passions is to be open to being moved by others. And so that entails then the movements of love draw one into communion with other humans, with God, with the natural world in ways that with beauty, in ways that always are drawing a person outside of themselves to communion with others. And so I think that that Aquinas does, I think, present a profoundly relational account of what it means to live a passionate life, although he doesn't frame it, he's still framing it in terms of the experience of what we would not consider the individual or the person. And so you don't see a kind of thoroughgoing sociological account in Aquinas, but you do see a system that demands relationship for flourishing. For Descartes, I'm not quite as sure. He biographically, he was he had inscribed on his tombstone something to the equivalent of he who lives well hides well, and he pretty zealously guarded his own independence and his own self, and so it's not clear to me how clearly drawn he was to relationships himself, or how his system demands that. But others who know Descartes better than I can maybe add more biographically about him.
Thank you. Joy Palacios, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kinghorn, for your talk. And this really makes me want to read Aquinas. I'm familiar with Descartes, but I haven't read Aquinas yet, and I really appreciated your comparison of their two ways of thinking about the passions. And I really like this idea of going back to a more integrated understanding of the self. And I was wondering, one of the interesting things about Descartes is that mechanistic view of the human sort of then maybe also lends itself to a move toward secularism, right? Because of course he's a Catholic, but it seems to me like for Descartes' understanding of the passions, the idea of God, even though it's there, is not as central as it is in Aquinas. So my question is, how do you think would it be possible for psychiatry to embrace Aquinas in a way that would work well in a pluralistic context? How are some ways that could work?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. With respect to Descartes, Descartes did, I think, consider himself a person of faith throughout his life. He never renounced in any way his faith. Certainly, God played a metaphysical role as the guarantor of certainty in his theory of knowledge. And I am still learning about Descartes' intellectual climate, but I think that at the time there was, in some ways, the movement that he was part of was in part preserving a space, I think, for the divine amidst what seemed like a kind of creeping movements to eradicate the divine from the natural world. And so you can in some way see Descartes as perhaps participating in what he thought was a defense of religious truth that I think has contributed in good or bad or neutral ways to our understanding of the cosmos or universe as inert nature. But with respect to Aquinas, so Aquinas is clearly writing as a Christian philosopher and theologian. There's no way in which he is ever going to write absent that entirely. But he's also, he got in significant trouble in his own time for relying so heavily on Aristotle. He was many of his propositions are actually condemned within a decade of his death by the Bishop of Paris for being too Aristotelian. He was he was a very generous reader of the kind of broader world of readers of Plato and Aristotle, but that had largely been texts of Aristotle preserved in the East and then translated back fairly recently into the Latin West. And so he knew of Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, and he was looked to them as peers. He disagreed with them on some things, but he certainly had a great respect. And the fact that he is always framing his work in a broadly Aristotelian frame, I think doesn't mean that although Aquinas himself would certainly see God as the highest good to which all humans intend whatever they think that they're doing, it's possible, I think, to take those principles of humans acting for what we perceive to be good, which is, which would be a broadly Aristotelian principle, and to still make that work in secular context of mental health care. So I work in a U.S. federal government-run healthcare system, and there's no way in which I bring a specific religious particularity into the work that I do, but I'm still am thinking constantly about, one, how to avoid reducing people to machines, how to understand my patients, whoever they are, and for whatever tradition they come from, as those who are on some kind of journey, but then to think about what's needed for the journey, and I'll speak a little more about this tomorrow. So I think in many ways, and certainly nearly everything I said today about the passions as signs of love don't require a theological context to have meaning. And so I think one can still understand passions to be oriented to love, even if people don't understand their love to be God in the way that Aquinas would have understood God. So I think there's ways to do it. I do think obviously you have to be careful, and I'm very careful in my own clinical practice to be sensitive to questions of power. And I teach in a university divinity school. I'm publicly write and speak as a theologian, and some of my patients are aware of that and some are not. But I'm always very careful in how I speak with them about these questions, that I not allow my own power as a physician in a public system to get in the way of the process that the patient needs.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Kinghorn. We have a question in the chat here. I'm wondering where forgiveness may fit in all of this. Is self-delusion an application of reality to control passions?
I would need to go back and look at how Aquinas specifically treats forgiveness, but which I honestly can't remember as we speak. But I think that what Aquinas would argue, trying to think with Aquinas in his general thought, is that I can't remember Aquinas on forgiveness. And generally, he speaks of a love of enemies as a kind of love that doesn't come naturally to us, but that rather is a love. And again, he's speaking in a Christian context, that we love our enemies in virtue of God's love for us, and the way in which through God we're able to love those whom God loves, including our enemies, even if by our nature we have no natural reason to be drawn to them. And so that would be one way that Aquinas would answer it. I think stepping out of thinking of trying to sit in Aquinas' shoes and just speak as a psychiatrist, that forgiveness is obviously incredibly complex. Forgiveness doesn't entail that that the relationship goes back to what it was before whatever the transgression happened that requires forgiveness. It might be that forgiveness happens, but there's still very significant boundaries. So forgiving is not forgetting. But forgiveness does allow for the possibility for someone to continue to act toward what's good, continue to move without having the thing that has happened to them continue to be in a position of mastery and control over their actions in their life. And so forgiveness can be a healing for the person who forgives, as well as for the person who's forgiven. It could lead to restoration of relationship, but it need not always. But in that way, I would say it's not self-delusion, because one can be very clear that forgiveness is not something that's pretending something didn't happen that did happen, or excusing something that's inexcusable. It could mean simply to make a decision that one's life is worth more than being stuck in a position of constantly reliving that that offense or transgression. And so in that sense, it can be rational, even if it's still painful.
Thank you. Tina Ruparel, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a really intriguing talk. And I apologize to begin with. I had to come in a little bit late, so I hope I'm not asking a question you covered already right at the beginning. But I was really curious about your treatment of, or your explanation of Descartes' understanding of the passions. And as I understand what you're saying, you show how the passions are primarily bodily, mechanistic, and apply to the soul or mind in those kinds of ways. And so given that, and I sort of just take it as read, that philosophers, physicists, physicians have not yet sorted out the question of consciousness, the so-called hard problem. And yet there are problems with dualism. At the same time, I'm wondering whether the problem, I think what you raised about Descartes sort of later on, about dualism, is not really the big problem, in the sense that what you've said later on in terms of what Aquinas brings to the table seems to be more about a concept of a relational self versus an atomic self. And I wonder whether the question of dualism is in some ways, you can see how it can feed into the notion of the atomic self, but it's not absolutely the key issue. I think I totally agree with Aquinas about the relational self, but I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit more about the problem of dualism, particularly if, for instance, we think about the mind as, if I remember Daniel Dennett, I think he talks about the mind as brain-shaped. And if we talk rather about the mind as, the nervous system shaped, then I think we have a way in which even I think physiologists and scientists would agree that actually the mind does, interact with the body in ways that we do now understand. And so if we just give Descartes that, to say it's not the pineal gland, but it's the entire nervous system and those systems that connect with it, then I think the dualism problem becomes less, right? And I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit more about where you see the dualism issue playing into the big question about the self.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. I think as I read Descartes, Descartes is usually, certainly in my own clinical field of psychiatry, Descartes is always seen as the absolute enemy that no one ever would want to claim. And people think, well, mental disorders are brain disorders, and so we're not Cartesian. And I think that there's more than one way to be Cartesian. And the significant thing about Descartes' claim in the Discourse on Method especially is not that he claimed an immaterial mind, but that he mechanized the body and made it wholly immaterial and simply space and extension. So Descartes' more radical innovation was not the immateriality of the soul, but it was the materiality and mechanism of the body as machine. That's, I think, his more enduring legacy. And in that sense, those who treat the body as machine, whether in mental health contexts or in biomedical research and clinical care contexts, are profoundly acting out Descartes' vision, even if they don't see themselves as Cartesian. And so that would be what I would argue is Descartes' more lasting legacy for mental health care. And actually, there's Damasio's book Descartes' Error that came out in 1994. Some people who've reviewed that have said that Damasio's own, and I'm not current on Damasio's work, but Damasio's vision of consciousness is emerging from the feeling of the body and a kind of connectional neuroscientific understanding of emotion and experience that gives rise to rationality, that actually is exactly what Descartes was laying the groundwork for in The Passions of the Soul. And so in some ways, maybe that book should have been called Descartes' Vision instead of Descartes' Error, because Descartes really did, I think, want to construct a mechanistic understanding of human consciousness. He just never got there and didn't have the tools to be able to do that. That's one answer. I'm not sure I answered the question about relationality specifically.
No, that's a great answer. Thanks. I look forward to your talk tomorrow more about social and relationality. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dr. Kinghorn. We have another question in the chat. Do Aquinas or Descartes have any sense of our modern pejorative view of passions as imperatives to repress or shun? What insights in mental health management can this give us?
Neither of them thought of passions as primarily negative in that sense, like as passions per se as unruly or excessive. I think Descartes, more than Aquinas, leaned toward that because he constantly was talking about ways to control the unruly passions, and so you can begin to see that in his thought. Obviously there's a subsequent long history of the emotions in which the language of the passions began to fade out. You begin to get more of theories of affections or moral sentiments. And then later, really only in the 19th century, did you have theories that were framed as theories of emotion. And in that context, the older word passion became more associated with anger and sexuality and violence and other things. We talk about crimes of passion in that way. And I think that's just a shift in common language more than it's anything that has a deep philosophical history to it or connection to it. But Descartes certainly leaned to that more than I think that Aquinas did that way. Does that answer the question? I'm happy to say more.
I think so, yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mindy.
Okay, we have a question from Katie Barg. I'm happy to say Katie is one of our many students who are here today. So Katie, welcome, and please fire away.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Kinghorn, for everything you just shared. I have a question for the psychiatrist part of you. I guess you are a whole person, but you made a kind of joke about Descartes fitting in really well as a medical researcher. And I was curious what maybe box you would want to put Aquinas in as a therapist. So you mentioned emotion-focused therapy. And I was curious if there were other therapy models that you thought would fit with this idea of treating people as wayfarers on a journey and not machines to be fixed, with an emphasis on that community and connection.
Yeah, is your question, thanks so much for the question, and thanks for being here today. Is your question, if Aquinas were to show up, what schools of psychotherapy would be consistent with his view? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that Aquinas would in many ways, I think, well, first of all, he probably would not have been a very good therapist. He was a pretty analytical guy who liked to sit in his studio and dictate commentaries on Aristotle and scripture and write things. And so I don't know if we would enjoy his presence if he were here with us today, although he was described as being somebody who was socially engaged in conversation and that kind of thing. But I think that his thought, though, I think that motivational interviewing, even though it's really comes from a more Rogerian context, with its understanding of humans is always intending some form of good, and then finding ways of being blocked for that and ambivalent in some ways. I think there's ways to unpack that in Aquinas' understanding of the will and of the passions. I think that he would appreciate in some ways even kind of first wave cognitive behavior therapy. Aaron Beck just passed away, and I think that in some ways, I think the idea that through a kind of reasoning about our own experience and around us, and that we can then begin to order our passions. I think that he was not averse to a kind of Stoic approach, but I do think though that emotion-focused therapy and therapies that see emotions as kind of primary media in which significant change occurs and in which habituation happens. And I think emotion-focused therapy is an example of that. I think interpersonal neurobiology isn't a school of psychotherapy, but it kind of speaks about that. I think that the idea that in the passionate life, that our passions aren't just hindrances to somehow being drawn to what's good, but the good life is an impassioned life in which we love and desire those things that are desirable, and we find delight and joy when they're attained, and we feel aversion toward those things that are not good for us. And so to be able to trust the life of the emotions and to live into them and to feel them wholly and truly is, I think, his broad vision of what that looks like. And I think, frankly, I think that any good form of psychotherapy will contribute to that. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Are there any more questions for Dr. Kinghorn? We've been giving him quite a workout. He's already busy to start out with. So I think what we'll do is we'll draw a close to today's discussion. And before we thank Dr. Kinghorn again, I just want to announce and bring your attention to the Chair of Christian Thought Level Lecture in Christian Ethics that Dr. Warren Kinghorn is giving tomorrow at 1 p.m. And the title is Why Mental Disorders Are Not Brain Disorders Alone, a Holistic Christian Approach to Mental Health Care. I've put information, if you haven't already registered, I've put that information on how to register at the 1610 mark in the chat box. You'll see there that you can click onto that link and you can register for tomorrow's talk. And I hope you join us for further discussion on such a poignant and important topic to be discussing. As you're saying, Dr. Kinghorn, that this touches all of us in every way, every day, especially I think in the last 20 months that we've been experiencing. Yes. So thank you so much for your insights and sharing not only your expertise in the field of psychiatry and theology, but also your personal interaction with how you apply these to your psychiatry. Thank you so much. And we'll see everybody tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your giving your Friday afternoon to this, and thank you. And I would welcome feedback from any of you about the ideas here or thoughts to continue in the future. So thank you.